continue with the next panel, focusing much more on the Visegrad countries, where they are heading and how they understand the European Union, what preferences they have for the future. My name is Zsuzsanna Végh, I'm Vice Chair of the Hungarian Europe Society, and I have here with me two excellent speakers, both from academia and more of the NGO think tank sector. On my right is Magdalena Góra. She is Assistant Professor at the Institute of European Studies at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. She focuses her research mostly on European external affairs, foreign affairs, and Europeanization in the Central European countries. And next to her is Jakub Klepal. He is Executive Director of the Forum 2000, which is an NGO foundation that was initiated back in the 90s by Václav Havel to support the values of democracy, human rights, and to support civil society development in Central and Eastern Europe. So in this panel, we would like to discuss a little bit what has happened with the Visegrad interpretation of cooperating in Europe and how these four countries, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary, see themselves as members of the European Union, where they see their own sovereignty and the EU's sovereignty should lie, and what their take is on the pending reforms of the European Union. We would like to focus a little bit on how what was previously mentioned, the perception of the EU as the savior has sort of shifted and changed in the Visegrad countries, and why they currently see the European Union entirely differently, why they are reclaiming their sovereignty, why they are pushing the agenda of a European Union of member states, and how we arrived to having a pledge to the European values and human rights as the basis of our cooperation, to have something as listed in the Hungarian V4 presidency documents, basis as respect for national and regional diversity, culture, and history, which if you interpret it in the context of Prime Minister Orbán's attitude towards European Union, respect for national, regional diversity means that just leave us and our domestic politics alone. So how we arrived from a European vision to a more particularized vision of Europe, and we will have our speakers shedding some light on these from the Polish perspective, and Jakub will talk a little bit about the most recent developments in the Czech Republic. We just had elections for the parliament in the Czech Republic last weekend, and it opens up a whole new set of questions about how Visegrad as a group will also go on in the future. So without further ado, I would pass the floor now first to Magda and ask her to present the paper that she also circulated to us before.
Thank you very much. I can use it. Thank you very much. Thank you, István, and thank you, Susie, and thank you all of you sitting here for having me. I'm an academic, and I'm coming from academic setting, and I just want to briefly tell you that I'm an empirical scholar, in a sense that what I do and my team is doing, and another research group that I'm participating is we predominantly look at the political actors' discourse on European integration in Poland and elsewhere, because we do comparative research between several settings, unfortunately due to linguistics constraints, not necessarily in the region, but that's another thing. But I also participated in research in the last 20 years that was the sociological investigation into how ordinary Poles are forming their opinions about the European integration. We've spent years going into the interviewing, hundreds of people and trying to extract what they really think about European integration. And I will. The presentation isn't really about that, but I think we can also discuss about this sort of discrepancy that was already mapped by the previous panel and experts about the discrepancy between the political level discourse and the ordinary citizens' discourse about the European integration. I'll focus on political discourse, parliamentary discourse, which is also very specific. It's much, I mean, it is also changing over time, but in principle, it's at least it's supposed to be discourse that is sort of merit-based in a way, at least partially. In contrast to the previous panel, but also in a continuation with that, instead of focusing on populism or Euroscepticism per se, what I would like to propose to you is to look at this from the perspective of politicization. Politicization made a great return into the academic discourse recently, with scholars sort of reflecting, and this is predominantly Western European focused research, that actually observed that all over the place we have increased polarization of opinions about what really is European integration, and in particular about how various policies are constructed and what they deliver. This, in a way, is allowing us to nuance as well, because there are two levels that politicization is trying to focus. The one is the EU as the construction, as a polity. And a lot of contestation, or the analysis of contestation, shows that citizens are in principle supporting this polity, the existence of the policy. They do not necessarily question whether it should exist or not, also in Central and Eastern Europe. While at the same time, they are performing, or they are expressing more and more contesting visions when it comes how it should be done on everyday basis. And then those opinions can significantly vary when it comes to one public policy to another public policy. Okay, and this is something, the scholars argue that we leave the permissive consensus realm, which is that the elites are doing integration and the public is in principle supporting in the way that it does or it doesn't, right? Expresses, yes, we support integration, but we give carte blanche to politicians. So, fill it in, right? I mean, we give you a mandate to do so. It's not happening anymore. And then obviously, so scholars argue the EU gone public, right? It is being discussed all over the place, as well in Central and Eastern Europe. So at some level, we can say that the processes in Central and Eastern Europe about the nuancing, the debate on European integrations, are something that we witness elsewhere in the continent. In a sense that there is an increased salience of the EU in national debates. There is a broadening spectrum of actors that are participating in those debates beyond the executive actors. Political parties are forming more and more sort of nuanced visions, but also other actors involved. Ultimately, there is the increased polarization of opinions about those issues, right? So this is what is politicization. But then a question is what prompts it? Because we already see in various research schemes that it's not uniform, right? I mean, you have different countries and you have different levels to this politicization. So obviously literature is proposing several options. First of all, crucial events and timing. And again, for Central and Eastern Europe, this is 2004, which already appeared in the first sort of panel, but also two crises that were also mentioned, the Eurozone crisis and then a migration crisis, right? I mean, those really prompted a lot of the politicization debates in countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Then scholars argue that the radical right-wing parties are very skillful in sort of putting the framing the EU integration the way that other parties really needs to respond, nuancing and polarizing further opinions. But in a Western European research, we already observed that, for instance, in German discourse, it wasn't radical parties. It was actually mainstream parties that sort of were responsible for polarization. So two models could happen. And obviously, so that the radical parties can sort of pick up this agenda or kind of elevate it to the level that sort of needs to be responded. But also, in case of Poland, for instance, when you will see, that would be rather German model, in a way that two mainstream parties, Law and Justice and Civic Platform, were actually responsible for polarizing opinions. And I'll just show you why and how. And then finally, which is, again, something that goes back to the debate following the first panel, cultural and identitarian frames that are used to depict European integration are more conducive to the politicization. So if you more frame European integration in sort of types like, who's in, who's out, or who can belong and on what conditions, and then what it does to who we are and to our allegedly traditional Polish or any other values, then it proves to be more sort of open to polarization. But there are also local factors in Central and Eastern Europe that are responsible for this. And particular one, which again I think Rosa was already mentioning to some extent, or Erin, I'm sorry, is that pre-enlargement debates in most of those countries was securitized. What it means is that there was the very specific discursive scheme that put European integration out of the ordinary political process. If you look into the Hungarian parliament or Polish parliament, how they were codifying the EU law into the national systems, you can see that there was a suspension of the ordinary bargaining politics. In order, and this securitization was going in a logic that any delay in integration with Western structures, NATO and EU, was perceived as a existential threat for those countries because they pretty much put all on this bet. So the opposition was perceived as jeopardizing this existential foreign policy in a way. So it was pretty much that any opposition against European integration was delegitimized prior to enlargement. Look at the V4 countries. I mean, in most of them, only the sort of very radical sort of fringes of the spectrum was raising criticism, both right-wing and left-wing, in a way. But then, in the middle, you have this super extraordinary agreement among the political elites that this is the direction. I'll quote Jarosław Kaczyński from 2006 in Polish Sejm. During the first few years of Polish Third Republic, the main task, even though rarely phrased this way, was accommodation of our country to the structures of the West. It was necessity, and without achieving it, all else would be impossible. This process is reaching its end today. Entry into the European Union will stop this process. And he was very right. Because what happens after 2004 is that this Pandora box is out of sudden opened. And then you have the return, you have normalization of the discourse on European integration. You have desecuritization, which is actually repoliticization, in a way that you are actually now, you can actually question European integration because we are in. So there is no this existential threat anymore. So you can do that, and then it starts to open. So, if you look at the Polish case, 75% of people voted for enlargement and 25 didn't. So those 25 has its own agenda that starts to proliferate in discourse. In a way, it seems to me that we need to sort of look at this from this perspective, that in most of those cases, it does not mean that there is any determinism or automatism in where this will lead us to, but at least this sort of opens the structure. Another possibility is also to look at the renationalization as the sort of I don't know, is a kind of, when you can imagine this sort of enlargement of the EU as really stretching the kind of political process, then it somehow, after 2004, kicks back or waves back in a way. It sort of returns back to its sort of form, and then this renationalization becomes a topic. Perceived in a way as sort of redefining sovereignty and the position of a nation state within the structure, but without this sort of idea before 2004 that you need to be careful because they cannot accept us, so then just don't say what you really think, in a way, right? And then the renationalization also appeared in the European discourse, and most profoundly, I think that the former president of the European Council was actually sort of commenting of this renationalization, which he thought is a form of politicization, because this sort of shows that on national level, you still need to react into the public policies that are constructed on the European level. In the end, we have a soft and hard versions of this renationalization elsewhere, also in Central and Eastern Europe. So, to the point. The analysis of the seventh term in office of Polish Parliament of selected debates shows that there are three main, I mean, you know, we conducted this research for entire period of 2003 to 2016, but due to the time constraints, I'll just focus on the very recent years. Seventh Sejm shows that there are three models when it comes to, you know, the future of European integrations are actually appearing. First is that something that was in Polish political discourse for long perceived as the F word, federalism, out of sudden appears as something that you can say it out loud. Minister Sikorski, who, by the way, as you may remember, was actually a Minister of National Defense in the Law and Justice government 2005-2007. He, in 2010, goes to Berlin, and in his speech, he calls for creating a genuine political union. And then since then, in Polish Parliament, the pro-Europeans are actually sort of framing the discourse as the agreement to the further federalization. They may still be cautious when it comes to where this should lead, not necessarily to the super state, but maybe to the like more multinational federalized structure and so on. So there is a more nuanced vision when it comes to, but the sort of the federalization is somehow putting them into more radical position that they were actually doing prior to this. So then the second camp that reveals itself is a moderate or soft renationalization camp. This is predominantly center law and justice, because law and justice, and it's also something important, is not really uniform internally when it comes to what they think about the European integration. So those this discourse from 2007 onwards, but predominantly 2010 and 11, is taking this position: we are for, but we are about the very conservative model of this European integration, right? It focuses on a strong fear of strong Germany, and then they are about the preserving national sort of competences. And then finally, the rejectionists are appearing, still relatively marginal up to 2015, but then you have clearly. You can locate where this discourse is located. It's predominantly Solidarna Polska, that is now a part of the ruling coalition, because just to remember, Poland is ruled by a coalition, United Right. It's not Law and Justice. And then right-wing parts of Law and Justice. And they are sort of voicing the vision that is there since 89, in essentially, right? And they are starting to talk this language. It's marginal in this seventh Sejm, but it becomes important later on, and I have really not that much time, right? So I will just go into the conclusions. Is that what happens with those three visions that are there after 2015 is that all of them got radicalized in a way. So obviously there is, it seems to me, based on a preliminary analysis of the debates, some debates after 2015 election, it's not as consistently applied as it was for the previous term in office in Sejm. But if you will do that preliminary, you can say that those pro-European camp, the federalists are there, and their discourse didn't really change significantly, except for the fact that they are even more stressing the predominant threat that they are constructing, which is core periphery syndrome. And they say, if we will not follow, they will leave us alone again. And you guys don't want that, right? And this is the message they are repeating all over the place and all the time. Then the soft renationalists are still there. And again, if you look at those debates, in somehow maybe in contrast to what you would extract from more media sort of take on those debates, it seems to me it's not really much different than it was prior to the elections. It's still there. It needs to deal with the fact that they are ruling now, so they need to somehow make it even more nuanced and concrete. But then what really has changed after 2015 is that the parties that were expressing hard renationalization agenda become pivotal in the new system, because the law and justice is ruling thanks to them. And then it gives them relative take on how, in a way, they are sort of hijacking the discourse, in a way. Specifically because it's the specifically because of the migration crisis. And this is my final comment here, is that through the use of this cultural and identitarian framing within the migration crisis, but also the fact that the conflict with the EU Institutions Commission, in particular 2016 onwards, when it comes to the quality of democracy and the actions against that in Poland, obviously also was conducive to more polarization, and specifically were elevating the role of the hard camp, call it this way. But the migration was really very skillfully utilized by these pivotal forces to somehow again hijack the dominant discourse of the ruling coalition. And I'll stop here. I'm running out of time, but I hope we can maybe broaden this in the discussion time. Thank you very much.
I would have a few questions, but I think I will leave it for after Jakub also has his contribution. So please, Jakub, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you for your invitation, István. Thank you, Suzy, for sharing this. I will give you a little bit of an overview of what is currently the situation in Czech Republic and what may be the consequences of that for the Visegrad, for Czech Visegrad policy, and for the atmosphere in Visegrad, and also for the within the broader EU policy context. I will start with giving you a little bit of an overview of the election results from last weekend, which I think are maybe interesting. Then I will try to analyze the aspects of that, and then try to suggest some possible consequences. As you know, the election in the Czech Republic last weekend was the parliamentary election, which is in our system the most important elections. It was much anticipated, and it was seen by many in the society as a historical election, because it promised some significant changes in the political landscape of the country. Even though this was expected, the result was actually much more of an earthquake than it was supposed to be. The results were such that, for example, the Slovak Prime Minister Fico, the day after elections, felt confident enough to go on a press conference and say that Slovakia from that day on is the pro-European island in Central Europe. There may be some truth to that. You realize the scope of the earthquake by looking at the political history of the independent Czech Republic since the beginning of the 90s. As you may know, the country has been fairly similar to many Western European democracies in the fact that there were two main dominant political forces in the Czech system: social democracy and civic democrats, essentially changing themselves in the government in different coalitions, but most of the time one of the members of these two parties was the prime minister. This has ended after this election. This has become a history. The election was paradoxical in a number of ways. One of them probably touches on an issue that has been discussed here, which is the lack of relationship between economic prosperity and to turn towards populism. Because the fact is that Czech Republic is now going, as many of the other Central European countries, through an unprecedented times of economic prosperity and well-being. The growth is for this year expected to be 3.6%. The unemployment is on record lows. There, in fact, is a shortage of labor force in Czech Republic. The salaries are growing on a record on a record rates. There is even seeming confidence of the population in the way how the country is going. I mean, there are record birth levels. There are high numbers of new mortgages taken by the population. So everything seems to be going in a right way in this socio-economic regard. And yet the population, if you look at the election results, has voted massively for a change of that. The participation in the election was about 60%, which was slightly higher than the last time. And out of about 4.5 million voters, about 3 million voters voted for some kind of an anti-system party, which is quite shocking. The winner, as you know, was ANO movement, led by billionaire Andrej Babiš, the second richest person in the country. I will talk a little bit more about him. There were some other anti-system parties that were successful in the election. One of them being the Pirate Party, which was, I think, second in the success of the anti-system parties. Then there was a right-wing extremist SPD party, and then there were the traditional communists, which were actually the only sort of populist anti-system losers of the elections, because their vote has dramatically declined. Let me tell you a little bit about the winners. I don't think I need to go into much detail. I think most of the people here know more or less who are we talking about. But if we are talking about populists, Czech Republic is now a place where we can actually observe different kinds of populists in action. I mean, there is several different kinds of populists that have been successful in this election. First is the ANO Babiš party, which is a newcomer, paradoxical newcomer, because, as you know, Babiš has been a member of the government coalition for the past 4 years. He was the finance minister. He is a long-time member of the country's elite. He has been a very successful businessman for a long time. He was even the part of the elite of the previous regime, as you know. He was part of the Communist Party and all that. He established ANO Party as his own political project, which is highly centralized around him. It works as a company essentially, and he promises to also govern the country as a company, which is part of his message and part of his political success. His party is extremely loyal. It's something that has not been seen on this scale at the Czech political scene. I mean, there is essentially no discussion, at least publicly, in the party. Everybody essentially repeats what the party leader says, and this is strengthened by the sort of ecosystem that he has around the party. There's several media outlets that he controls. There is a large economic empire that he controls within the Agrofert company, which spans from chemicals to agribusiness. Parts of it are present also here in the Central European countries. Parts of it are also present in other countries in Western Europe, which is part of some of our pro-European hopes. But it is, in general, a very well-functioning project that has many, many levels, and I think that is probably the biggest problem with this group and with this political leader. The second very successful populist group that was successful in the election is SPD, which is an extremist, almost racist party led paradoxically by half Japanese politician Mr. Okamura. Their position is extremist, anti-Islam, anti-migrant. They also focus on direct democracy, which is one of their key principles, and their mission is to push through a referendum on EU, on remaining in the EU. There are also significant signals that parts of the party are pro-Russian. There are people that are engaging, some new members of parliament that are engaging with different pro-Russian groups, and the whole party is considered by most of the other players in the political system so far, even by Babiš, as unacceptable as a possible partner. Then there's Pirates. You may have heard of this party. It's a pan-European movement started in Sweden. Czech Pirate Party is at the moment the second most successful pirate party in Europe. I mean, after the Icelandic pirates, they have reached the highest election results, almost 11%. We are not exactly sure what their program is. They are very undefined so far, but the general sense is that they are relatively liberal, modern. They are very young. Many of their members and leadership is young, well-educated, and so far they have been defining themselves as pro-European and also anti-extremist, for example. So in this way, I think that's a relatively positive signal. Then there is, of course, the traditional parties that have been sort of successful in the election, which gives some hope, but also there is, of course, problems within it. I will not go into details, just mentioning that the Civic Democratic Party that was before in the previous elections almost wiped out of the political landscape has come back in a certain way. That's a typical conservative, socially conservative, economically liberal political party. Can be compared maybe to British conservatives, but that is very wide and unprecise comparison. There are some elements in it that are also fairly extremist. I'm speaking mainly about Mr. Václav Klaus Jr., the son of the former president, who is also very critical of the EU membership, and he is also very critical of migration. And as some of you may know, his father, former President Klaus, has been linked to some extreme forces, including the AfD in Germany. He has actually been part of their electoral campaign before the German parliamentary elections. And then there are some of the smaller traditional conservative, so Christian democratic, more or less parties in the parliament. I will not go into details. The main losers, I think, or the biggest losers in this elections were the traditional social democrats, who have been until now, and they still have the prime minister, but they have gone from percentages in their 30s in 2006 to 7.5% in this election. So they have been essentially wiped off the political map, and they will have a very difficult time surviving because they have problems in the leadership, they have problems in their base, they have problems on a number of levels. And there's also the good news about the communists. I mentioned that communists have been a long-term feature on the Czech political map, always getting around 10%, a little bit over, and now they have been significantly pushed down. Unfortunately, this vote has often transferred to the vote for Mr. Okamura and his extreme right party. So that is essentially just a change for a maybe even more radical way of extremism, because the communists have become sort of a part of the political system and not really an anti-system party anymore. What will be the result? What will be the consequences of these results for the Czech Republic? In the short term, there is, of course, sort of a political paralysis, a confusion, because there is coalition talks at the moment happening, and none of the democratic parties and the pirates seem to be willing to form a coalition with Mr. Babiš. He needs at least one or two coalition partners, depending on their strength, because he has 78 mandates in the parliament of 200. And he needs to have a majority of at least 101 MPs. And at the moment, he doesn't seem to be able to get that majority, but there is apparent interest on the side of Mr. Okamura, the extremist party, to form or to enter a coalition, which Mr. Babiš at the moment is negative to. So there are several ways how this can go. There can be a caretaker government. There can be a change of heart in some of the democratic political parties that will enter the coalition, or there can be a more significant role for the president of the country, which again is fairly problematic, because the president is Mr. Zeman, who also is very close to some of these radical anti-European and anti-migrant forces on the Czech political scene. Despite this seemingly bleak picture, the mid-term and longer-term consequences are maybe not as terrible as they may seem on the face of it. Mr. Babiš and ANO are sort of pragmatic opportunists, I would say. They are not extremists. They are not populists. I think the goal there is to acquire power, to sort of maybe even change some aspects of how the country is operated. But there is at the moment, no signal of him wanting to leave the European Union, wanting to leave the NATO. So in that sense, there maybe we don't expect that much of a difference immediately. Economically, the policies will remain more or less the same. On the internal domestic political scene, there may be, I think, some attempts to go in the direction of what we have seen in Hungary, for example. So lessening of freedom, a little bit tightening the screws gradually. We have seen that in the previous government, how Mr. Babiš was finance minister, was able to use for example, the financial administration in order to press his political opponents, to threaten them a little bit. So we'll see how that goes. Also, what we will have to get used to is that anti-Western rhetorics and anti-EU rhetorics will enter the mainstream. So far, it has been part of of the more extreme parts of the political discussion. Now, this is even in the case of Mr. Babiš, and more so in the case of the other parties. This is the mainstream. What will happen in the long run? I have some points here, but I think it's maybe for the discussion later on. What I would like to look at a little bit on what the relations or what the consequences will be for the Czech foreign policy and for sort of the policy towards Visegrad, within Visegrad, and for the EU. As I said, we do not expect immediate radical change in the Czech policy, foreign policy orientation, but we will definitely see more of this egoistic, sovereignistic approach to policies. Mr. Babiš and his party and some of the other parties that have been successful are very transactional in their views of foreign policy. So they will always try to use foreign policy as in a way to show the electorate that they are actually getting something in return for what they are doing. It will be strongly anti-immigrant. The migration has not been mentioned here so much in the morning, but migration played a key role in the Czech election. The anti-Islam rhetoric, even though Czech Republic is not really a country with many immigrants, at least from the Islamic world, this has been a key element in the election campaign. There will also be a much less strict view of Russia in the Czech foreign policy. There will also be probably more attempts to look for alliances with other populist, opportunist leaders. Bovish has already mentioned close relationship with Mr. Kurz in Austria, and there will be probably other attempts to in this direction. On Visegrad, this implies no immediate change of policies. I think there is a possibility that Babiš will actually get on very well with if he becomes prime minister indeed with the other leaders of the Visegrad countries, but he also wants to look for beyond Visegrad. He already, as I said, mentioned Austria as a strong partner with Kurz as the chancellor, but he also is mentioning Slovenia, Croatia, and wants to focus on key and practical issues for him: migration, quality of food, etc. He doesn't, on the EU side, as I said, sort of more transactional policies at the moment. No euro membership, even though country is ready for it. There's actually a political consensus of not going into euro, and there will be escape voting of EU. That has become a key element of political campaigning in Czech Republic. EU is essentially there to be blamed for anything that's bad. And I will probably stop here, and then we can discuss further.
Thank you very much. If I may.